Welcome back. You're still tuned in to News and Views on myself, Salailo Makwidiri. We're going to be switching gears now to a very, very important story, one that's quite troubling, but also very, very critical to unpack. We'll be talking about public school safety in South Africa, which is still largely compromised as a national vetting program to screen teachers against the National Register for Sex Offenders has largely stalled, and some convicted sex offenders remain in positions at schools. And joining us now to unpack the scale of this failure, what's gone wrong, and what must happen now is the editor of Viewfinder, Daneel Knoetze, whose investigation helped expose critical gaps in the process. Daneel, thank you so much for your time. Really, really appreciate you joining us this morning on News and Views, and looking forward to a very, very eye-opening and important conversation.
Thank you so much for having me, and good morning to your viewers.
I think we'll jump right into it. Your investigation found that fewer than 1 in 10 teachers have been properly vetted against the NRSO. And how should we interpret this figure? What does it reveal about institutional failure in the educational sector when it comes to vetting who gets to be in the classroom and around children?
Thank you. Yes, so I must qualify that my investigative findings, the expose I published, is a couple of months old and dated by now, but certainly there's been a years-long failure, and I would be remiss to think that anything has changed in terms of the status quo, the slow rate at which teachers have been vetted. I looked incidentally for latest figures. None have been published by the department. The reason we're having this discussion now is that there's been some news reporting around the department's willingness to pay for student teachers the kind of nominal vetting fee that it costs to have your certification with the sex offenders registers done. And that's why this is being raised again. But what we found after some months of investigation, I might add, is that there was a big commitment made by the Department of Basic Education in 2022 already to retroactively vet all teachers against the National Register for Sex Offenders, which holds a list of convicted sex offenders in South Africa. The question might be, why is this necessary? Wouldn't we assume that teachers are vetted and cleared as not being priorly convicted sex offenders before they are hired? And what our investigation uncovered thus was that this is not just a formulaic exercise as the department has billed it, but that in fact there has been a long history of blind spots, of failures, of ambiguity, and of shortcoming in terms of ensuring that new appointees are vetted when they are coming in as teachers to the system, and that this process now is largely an attempt at rectifying a historical failure or blind spot. Now, their original deadline for doing all the teachers in the country, about 450,000, was the end of 2023. We are now, or we were at the time of me publishing my findings, halfway through 2025, 2.5 years later. And it was at that, at that time that we found that only 10% of the entire body of teachers that had actually been vetted. And we unpacked various reasons and challenges for that, but conclude really that it is a systemic failure, and the buck must stop at the Department of Basic Education in Pretoria.
No, most
and
definitely.
The minister, for that matter.
Yes. One other thing that you highlighted is the fact that in at least some provinces, there's been around 49 convicted sex offenders which were identified in schools, and in some instances they appear to remain in post. Okay, can you expand a bit on that, and what mechanisms or oversight simply failed in those cases specifically?
Yeah, so you touch on something really important here, is that the vetting was actually outsourced to the 9 provincial departments of education, who are the employers of teachers in the public school system in South Africa. So not every province has performed on the same level. Some provinces have vetted more teachers, some have vetted almost none. We highlighted the Eastern Cape and KwaZulu-Natal, where there's a particularly high burden of reported sex crimes and abuse. had not vetted any, or very few. So I might stand corrected. And what we did is we looked at where there has been some progress made, and we found that in the provinces where there's been progress made, 49 teachers have already been identified. What we found then is if you extrapolate the rate at which they were found and identified in these provinces across the entire country, we found that in excess likely of 230 sex offenders would have been in their posts, and many of them would have remained there at the time that this vetting exercise kicked off. Remember, I said earlier they would not have been vetted necessarily when they were hired originally, so they would have entered. They could have entered the system with prior sex offense convictions. As to the process by which or why it is that some of these offenders are still in situ at their schools, well, we got various responses, but basically there was an appeal to due process, that you can't just fire somebody once this is identified, that there needs to be some sort of due process. And we had assurances that, for instance, some of these identified sex offenders were removed from classrooms and placed in other roles at the schools pending a process. But yeah, I think if ever there's need for an expedited process and an automatic dismissal, I think it would be in the scenario, it would be well argued that it would be in a scenario where a teacher is found to have hidden a prior sex offense for which they were convicted, and that really is an unacceptable status quo for those people to still remain employed while a process is following its due course.
Most definitely. And I think the most concerning aspect of this is, this goes beyond just statistics and numbers. There are human lives at stake here, the lives of young children, which are being gambled with. You reference specifically the case of Lindy, a former pupil who was abused at a school, and that abuser was hired without any background checks. What does that specific example tell us about the urgency of this issue and the kind of danger that children are put in front of?
Absolutely. So I think, we've got a tendency to look at this from a bird's eye view, a statistical view, as you say, to see these as numbers and to analyze it from that perspective. But what we've got to remember, as you rightly point out, is that, young people are incredibly vulnerable to, and the impact on them is incredibly massive if they are abused in this way. And we sought to highlight the case of one young woman who experienced this 10, 15 years ago when she was in primary school. Her case was actually aired in the Western Cape High Court, and so there was a lot of documentation and record, and we also spoke to her and her mother. And what that case showed was that this is the consequences of this failure. The abuse, the rape that happened was absolutely brazen, heinous crime committed by a teacher in a very rural setting where obviously the appeal to law enforcement and accountability structures is perhaps lessened. It had a precipitous impact on this young lady. Her life was really upturned and ruined. She still lives with her mother. She feels that she was really stunted in her growth and ability and confidence. What this case further showed us was that the accountability mechanism, even though this case was reported against the principal, failed. He was found not guilty. He remained in post. And it was only later, when a civil case was brought against the department and against the principal for damages in the Western Cape High Court, that there was a semblance of vindication and justice for this girl who had reported this. The Western Cape High Court found that it was a miscarriage of justice, and in fact that it wasn't just the rapist, Nolan Swallenpool, who was liable. It was in fact the Western Cape Department of Education for having hired him in the first place. So this is vicariously liable by virtue of having done that. So this is not just a question of due diligence. This is a question of being culpable and liable for the crimes that are committed by these teachers if they have been missed by the department in terms of due process and vetting at their employment.
Mm, mm, mm. Um, the responsibility of vetting in itself crosses, various departments, several departments within the ecosystem of the education kind of spectrum. You have the education department itself, police, and the judiciary. How much of this is about lack of capacity versus lack of will, and where does the primary blame lie here?
You're quite right in pointing out that the entire vetting procedure is highly dependent on cooperation from the police, who take the initial, who give the initial kind of documentation that is required then to be submitted by the education departments, the provincial ones, overseen by the national, to the Department of Justice and Constitutional Development, which is where the sex offenders register is housed. So yes, at every stage of this, we've seen dysfunction, breakdown, and a lack of engagement and communication and cooperation between these departments. So even though the process seems very simple when laid out, when you realize that it depends on this level of cooperation between three different departments, essentially, you can see that there's a potential for breakdown. We highlighted that police were not always cooperative or clued up as to what their responsibility to this process was. We saw that the communication from the Department of Education, all the way from national through the provincial structures to teachers and principals, often failed. There was a lot of confusion about what was required. And we have seen capacity and bottlenecks at the Department of Justice, which suddenly is tasked with processing a large amount of incoming clearance certificate applications and has only a handful of people dealing with those on the daily. So that gives you the overview. Where does the buck stop? Well, this is an initiative of the Department of Education nationally and the provincial departments which employ teachers. And I think ultimately it is their failure and responsibility to have designed a process which is seamless, to have ensured a proper communication with their structures, and to have facilitated engagement and collaboration with the other departments. They are the leaders in this, and I think that's where the buck must stop. But of course, they would argue that they have done a lot and that their hands are somewhat tied by challenges in other departments as well, which is not entirely untrue. But I think that the buck ultimately should stop with the Minister of Education and her functionaries in different setups in the public education sector.
Mm, mm. What are the norm and standards internationally that South Africa can take some lessons from that we're just not getting right?
To be perfectly honest, I can't answer to an international best practice because it didn't really form part of my
Hmm.
investigation of what's happening on the ground. So I'd be amiss if I tried to speculate on that. I'm sorry
Mm,
that
mm.
I
No,
can't help you in that regard.
no worries at all. But just for the parents, for the pupils, and the public who feel largely exposed and betrayed by these failures, what would you say are some of the immediate actions that should be taken by the Department of Basic Education, provincial departments, to restore that safety and trust back in schools? Your report was a few months ago, I think 6 months and a few days ago, but still to this day you mentioned there
Yeah.
hasn't been any updates or anything being done about it. What would be the appropriate response at this current moment?
Well, I think something that we found in looking at this issue is that we were quite astonished at how little was known about this failure,
Mm,
how it hadn't captured the public discourse, that in light of its very, very serious ramifications. This has the potential to be a very big advocacy and civil society talking point. And I think awareness, reading about it, questioning, and of course that lack of awareness and advocacy and public discursive engagement with the subject matter insulated the department from pressure from the parents, the public, civil society in the education sector. And so I think one of the first steps is to just be aware of this, to ask questions. I mean, this is something that has to be implemented at the level of schools by principals, in its most basic kind of on the boots on the ground level. And so parents and civil society would not be amiss in their local communities to raise this question with the school governing bodies, with the principals, with other parents, and to really ask and demand answers and progress. You should be able to ask your principal how many teachers have been vetted at my child's school, and they should be able to give you an answer to that, because it ultimately would fall to their responsibility to have overseen it in their school staff bodies. So that's something I think that anybody could do, especially if they have children in public schools in South Africa.
I wanted to touch on that exact point. It was going to be my next question. What steps can parents take, when it comes to making sure that the teachers that are in their children's schools are vetted, and there are actually procedures that are put in place to, be sure who stands in front of their children, who spends time with their children. Can you do that as a parent? Can you approach
Of
the
course you
school
can.
your child goes to and ask to see that kind of information?
Listen, the in the public sector, the teaching fraternity and the managerial structure and the governing structure of a school is accountable ultimately to the children and the parents that that school serves. So 100%, I mean, this is not complicated. The question that can be elevated to the school governing body and to the principal is, have you initiated the vetting procedure at our school? What has it looked like? And how many clearance certificates from the sex offenders register have you received and communicated up the chain of command, to the MEC's office, or in the provincial government? So that those are very easy questions that anybody that doesn't even have a deep understanding of this process is able to ask, and they demand very simple answers: yes or no, how many, what does the process look like, and I would really encourage parents to raise exactly those questions. Has the process started at this school? Because in many schools it seems that it hasn't. Years later, it seems that there's been a willful or just ignorance of what was required, and so nothing has been done. Has the process of vetting started? And how many teachers at my child's school have received clearance certificates from the sex offenders register?
Mm, mm. Daneel Knoetze, thank you so much for joining us, and for painting that very, very bleak picture. But I think most importantly, for giving parents the knowledge that they do have the right to approach schools and ask the principals about, the teachers, and if whether or not they've been vetted. So I think that's a very, very important point to leave us with. Really, really appreciate you giving us the time. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a lovely afternoon. Cheers, everyone.
Go Daneel Knoetze, editor at Viewfinder. Giving us, I think, insight on a very, very concerning story, very concerning turn of affairs. If you just joined us, short explainer, essentially a national vetting drive to remove convicted sex offenders from South Africa's public schools is failing. More than a year after the official deadline, fewer than 10% of the teachers have been properly screened against the National Register for Sex Offenders. Investigations by Viewfinder reveal that confusion, lack of coordination across departments, non-compliance by teachers and police, and also the justice system have left children exposed. They've left children exposed to all kinds of dangers, all kinds of predators that might be lurking within school premises. And in some provinces in South Africa, convicted sex offenders identified in schools remain in posts. Some of them teach, some of them are still doing administration work. And it looks like the Department of Education, government in general, is failing to get a hang of this situation. And it should raise concerns, especially for parents. How do you now start getting into grasp with the fact that the people that are standing in front of you children each and every day, the people that are spending more time with your children than you actually do, because that's the fact. Children spend more time in school than they do at home. Those people are not properly vetted. The government doesn't know where they've been, who they are, except for the fact that they possess a teaching qualification and they've been hired. And I think what's important, and as you know, this new year turns and children are going to be going to new schools, and the start of the school year is going to be a whole hullabaloo around uniforms and what schools your children go to and stationery. What should be added to the conversation is parents approaching the principals of the schools and asking, are the teachers vetted? Are there clearance certificates that you can show me of the people that are in the premises that my child will be spending most of their time in, the people that I'm entrusting the life of this little person that's helpless and innocent into the hands of, are vetted? They are not in any way have a history of sexual offenses, because we've seen it in so many instances where children get sexually assaulted, get raped in schools, places that you think should be the most safe, in society. For instance, remember that story? Well, all seem to have forgotten now, because that's how South Africa seems to be, where we get angry for 5 minutes on social media, we tweet, go crazy, post statuses, and then we forget. But that child was sexually assaulted, was raped out of school. So, because the government is failing, it's now the prerogative of the parents to make sure that you ask those difficult questions and you get these schools to act, to move, to find out if they're not harboring any sex predators within their premises. And I'm seeing very, very disgusting comments here from Helen Rosine, from Jack. You guys are disgusting. I won't even show the comments that you guys are putting up on this interview, because we're talking about the lives of children here. So if this is funny, or it's a way to make it racial and to give all kinds of disgusting comments, I won't entertain those. I'll be talking to people who are concerned about their children, no matter whether they're black or white, they are Jewish, they're Christian, they're Hindu, doesn't matter. People who care about their children, turn of the new school year, approach the schools and ask about the vetting process of their teachers. How many of them have been vetted, and do they have clearance certificates? That's about it. Because we live in a dangerous country. Society has become, I don't know, something that I don't think any of us would have imagined it to be. Schools are not safe anymore. Shopping malls are not safe anymore. Even homes are not safe anymore. So where you can protect your children, please do that. We've come to the end of today's edition of News and Views. Thank you so much for staying with us for the past 2 hours. My name is Selailo Makwidira, and for myself and everyone that made today's edition a possibility, sharp. We'll see you again soon.